Good evening, and welcome to another exciting episode of Did You Know, coming to you exclusively, on Volt 104.3 FM, the only radio station you're going to be enjoying what we have for you this evening. The name of the show is Did You Know? And this week we are going back to the 15th century. There's a popular Nigerian song that says, I dey go back to my village. We are not going back to the villa, right? We are going back in time. So the spaceship is ready. I've queued in the coordinates. In a few seconds, we are going to start that journey. And today, I want to break the ice by letting you in on a little secret, right? Did you know that one man literally walked into an empire and restructured it, not with violence, but with vision? And in doing so, he created the largest empire Africa has ever seen. And for today's show, I'm taking you back to 1493 West Africa, when a military general named Muhammad just defeated the sitting king, but instead of ruling like a warrior king, he did something radical. He later went blind in life, lost everything, was exiled to an island infested with mosquitoes and toads, and still managed to change the trajectory of an entire continent. So, without further ado, let me break you and reintroduce you to King Askia Mohammed the First, right? And it's going to be, as I say almost every time, another exciting show, because trust me, what we have tonight is a scintillating show wrapped with or served with a cocktail of jazz, right? And without getting ahead of myself in this one, I want to just break you into this story for today very slowly, very subtly, while we discover this character, and we are diving way back to the 15th century. We are going to be looking at a very important figure who ruled the biggest empire in Africa, talking about the Songhai Empire, and turned it into a beacon of learning, trade, and administrative genius that still echoes today. Yes, we are going to be going into that. And now, you know how we do it. If you're an ardent follower of the show, every week at sometime later on in the show, we have a very special segment where we call it the 4M Blueprint. And the 4M Blueprint are the life lessons you can pull out of this story and apply today, right? So the 4M Blueprint is going to be coming later on this show. I'm going to be telling you, giving you the tools, showing you how you could even apply it today in your life, in your business, in your finances, and all about that. So if you're ready like I am, let's dive into it. At the return of this break, I want to play a very, very, energetic tune coming to you all the way from one of the composers of that I really love, talking about Yanni. And the ensemble I want to play for you is Adagio in C minor. When we return from this brief music break, I'm going to let the cat out of the bag in a way I already have, but with more details in HD and in 4K resolution. Don't go anywhere, I'll be right back. Welcome back to Did You Know, coming to you exclusively on Volt 104.3 FM. Yes, if you're just joining me, you're in for another phenomenal ride back in time through the looking glass. And today we're going back to late 15th century. Yes, we're going back to a time when the Sahara Desert stretches endlessly in the north, when the Niger River curves through the landscape like a lifeline, and along those waters sits the Songhai Empire, a vast network of cities, traders, scholars, and gold. Yes, gold. Now, don't get me started on gold. We're going to do an episode on gold sometime in the future, hopefully. And we are coming and settling in on a city on this journey. We've just arrived in the Songhai Empire. Yes, and Gao is the capital. Now, Timbuktu is also a rising trade hub, and the empire is powerful, but though it's rough, the current ruler, Soni Ali, is a brilliant military tactician, but he's brutal. He persecutes Islamic scholars, raids without mercy, and he rules through fear. But on the horizon, you know how they say on the horizon, change is coming, and change is coming in the form of a new leader, because in Gao, there's a young military general who serves under Soni Ali, and his name is Muhammad. Now, he was born around 1443 and comes from, of course, noble Songhai heritage, which means he's educated, he's connected, and he's observant, very observant. And he watches Soni Ali rule, he sees the cracks, he sees an opportunity. And most importantly, Muhammad is a devout Christian. So the scholars, as they were called back then, the ulama, those brilliant Islamic thinkers in Timbuktu who've been persecuted, under Soni Ali's reign, they are watching Muhammad too, because whenever any king comes to power, at the peak of their power, a lot of things start happening, which is there are men who are shuffling in the background, right? Shuffling in the background, who are looking to ascend too. So either the king is going to consummate his reign by picking a successor among his children, or one of these guys that have been shuffling in the wings can come in and take over power, right? So, of course, the ulama are watching Muhammad, they are watching Soni Ali, and they are hoping now that change is in the offing, and hopefully something is going to give, right? Because they can't continue living the way they've been living. So, what made Muhammad different from every other general vying for power was that men were generally ambitious for their own sake, right? I'm going to segue a little bit into a little mini microcosm of what we are talking about today, right? Destiny versus purpose, right? One, destiny is something that serves ego, right? And purpose serves service, in the sense that when you say, hey, this guy is destined for greatness or whatever, it can easily feed into ego, right? You feel untouchable, you feel invincible, and then you are actually sometimes ill-prepared for what you're called to do, and sometimes that can be scuttled. Whereas somebody else who doesn't feel destined for something, who feels a calling to do something because of what they see, what they observe, and how they react. Now, not to go scriptural on you, but this was something similar to what Moses was feeling back then, seeing the plight of the Israelites, not knowing he was an Israelite, and then obviously knowing that he isn't the direct heir to Pharaoh's throne. So that calling led him somehow to take some actions to alleviate the Israelites and their plight. Now, going off that, back to the story. While most generals were vying for power for its own sake, they wanted the throne, they wanted the gold, they wanted the ego boost. Muhammad had a purpose. He believed that the Songhai Empire could become something greater, not just military dominance, but intellectually vibrant. A place where Islamic scholars flourished, where trade networks multiplied, and where wealth circulated rather than being hoarded. We'll come back to that. Okay, so just put that somewhere in your notepad, put that somewhere, and we'll come back to that. So he wasn't driven just by conquest alone. He was driven by a vision of what could be. That's the most important factor. And we'll come back to that. So what happened next was that Soni Ali died in 1492, and his son, Soni Baru, was named successor. Logical, right? But there was a problem. Muhammad's clarity of purpose made all the difference, because he looked at Soni Baru, the rightful heir, and saw something critically dangerous, which was a leader without the commitment to Islamic reform, a leader who had no vision to unify religious and political power. So he just wanted to continue as it had been before. You know, there's a saying that goes, as it was in the beginning, so shall it be, and blah, 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 right? So that was what Soni Baru was all about, maintaining power, not necessarily being a devout Muslim in the sense, not necessarily trying to fuse government power with politics, basically just continuing the way it was and as it was going. So this does not mean that what happened next was legitimate or was lawful, but because this is history, sometimes what happens in the wake of certain transitions are not lawful or legitimate. Sometimes they happen because there's a vacuum in power, and it's also something we need to learn from whenever there's a transition, because whenever there's a transition, things change and a lot of things can also happen. So Muhammad didn't see an opportunity for personal glory in that context. He saw it as an opening to transform a nation. Yes. And that shift from personal ambition to that purpose now being to serve the nation, to transform the nation, that leadership in that sense was what separated him from everyone else who was jockeying to be the next king of the Songhai Empire. And so what happened was that he seized power. Now, seizing power is never clean. Don't let anybody gaslight you or brainwash you that seizing power is clean and blah blah blah. You know, seizing power was never going to be clean. So Sonny Baru was the established choice. The nobility supported him. The military backing, though, however, was divided. If Muhammad moved against him, he'd be seen as a usurper, a betrayer, someone putting religion above legitimate succession. And so the stakes, everything was high, as it should be. Lose the gamble and Muhammad dies as a rebel. Though if he wins, he gets to reshape a continent. And this is poetic, talking about history, because so many things are, you know, there's a spindle, and that spindle can either be turned in one direction or another. And when that happens, a lot of people's lives and a lot of things are at stake. So, April 12, 1493, outside the city of Gao, on a plain called Anfao, Muhammad's forces lined up against Sonny Baru's army. The tension was that Muhammad's army was smaller, fewer soldiers, less established positions, but his troops had something Sonny Baru's didn't. They believed in the cause, they believed in what they were fighting for, and not just who they were fighting against. They believed in who they were fighting for, the cause, and also they believed that the man on the throne wasn't the right one for the job. So basically, it was a tough one. The armies clashed, and the battle was decisive because Muhammad won. Right? Yes, he won. But here's what's remarkable about this moment, because he didn't execute his rival. He didn't humiliate him publicly. He simply assumed power, took the title Askia, a honorific title that would echo through history, and he declared his purpose, which was to reform Songhai, to make Islam central to government, and to create something that would outlive his generation. So the old way, which was to rule by force and fear, was out of the door, and the new way was to rule by vision and structure. And this distinction will matter enormously as we get into the story, right? So most new rulers naturally would consolidate power locally, build loyalty in Gao, strengthen the military presence. But Muhammad went counterintuitive with his decision. Yes, counterintuitive. In 1496, 3 years after taking power, he left Gao and organized a pilgrimage to Mecca. This is the second character from our history journey or adventure that has taken a pilgrimage to Mecca. When we talked about Mansa Musa, the richest man ever in Africa, he also took a pilgrimage. But this time around, what's his name now? Askia Muhammad took a pilgrimage to Mecca, and he went with a party. Now, troop of soldiers. He took 500 horsemen and 1,000 foot infantry, and he traveled with such magnificent and visible wealth that merchants in every city he passed through told stories about him. That man, he carries kingdoms on his shoulder. That was the gist in town. Remember when we talked about Mansa Musa, we said that he literally broke the economy of Egypt by making gold as common as dust in Egypt, right? We'll come back to that because this man did the same thing, but he wasn't giving out gold. He was actually the way he carried himself, the way he moved with his people, the amount of wealth he displayed when he traveled through, that made that reputation what people ascribed to him in that time. So when he reached Cairo, eyewitnesses described something jaw-dropping. This is another thing that we said about Mansa Musa, because Muhammad was so generous with gold donations, and I'm quoting historical accounts here. He caused the price of gold to drop across the entire Mediterranean world. Twice in a row, man. Twice in a row. Mansa Musa, and then, of course, Askia Mohammed. How this seems to tie these two people together. The fact that they were generous. Two, they crashed the economy in Mansa Musa in Egypt, but Muhammad across the Mediterranean world. So think about that for a moment. One man's generosity literally crashed a regional economy. The other man's generosity, Mansa Musa, crashed a country's economy. So gold became less valuable because there was suddenly so much of it circulating everywhere, basically. So the genius of Muhammad was that he returned from that pilgrimage transformed politically. He came back bearing Islamic credentials, which is the title of Al-Hajj and Khalifa. He had suddenly studied with Al-Maghli, one of Islam's great reformers, and he wasn't just a military general anymore who had seized power. He was a religious sanctioned reformer. Now, why is religion so essential to what we do as a people? Why is religion so vital to the way we lead our lives, to the way we do what we do? Why is religion so vital? And how can the dispensation of the day marry both? Because it's seen all over history that people, great reformers, great transformers, merge two of these three mountains of society together. And so back to the story now. He was now officially religiously sanctioned as a reformer, and the scholars and the ulama in Timbuktu who had been persecuted under Sonny Ali, they finally had a ruler who earned their respect and understood their value, and of course who would protect them and elevate them in society. That pilgrimage cost him 50,000 ducats in debt, but it bought him something far more valuable. It bought him legitimacy and the platform to implement transforming changes to society in Songhai Empire. And so from 1497 onward, Askia Mohammed became a reformer in motion, and he made a lot of implementations, a lot of things he changed in Songhai Empire. And to start off with that, we're going to be looking at some of those things he did to establish his legacy and of course his impact on the Songhai Empire. So he implemented Sharia law across the empire. He also created a complex ministerial system: ministers of finance, justice, agriculture, trade, interior affairs, and so much more. Then he moved over to the next thing, which was he standardized currencies and weights across all territories. It might sound boring, but it transformed commerce in the region. Now, merchants could trade confidently because they knew the measures were consistent. And also, he built a professional standing army instead of relying on citizen militia. We see this happen a lot. A couple of years ago, we heard the story of, what's his name now? Park Ji-sung and a couple of other people who had to leave what they were doing in Europe, come back to serve in the military, right? But the standard in the Songhai Empire wasn't citizens being drafted into the militia. It was a fleet of soldiers, it was a standing army who were 100% committed to the army by oath. Now, they didn't have a life of their own, basically, because they didn't have families and all of those stuff. They, being in the army was life sentence or something relative to that, because you could be called up to anywhere, you could move around. You were literally like in a lack for better word, like a zombie, because you didn't have life for yourself. You were called into the army, you were bound by oath. A couple of people will remember what the analogy I'm trying to pull here, which is, it was like taking the black, right? If you take the black in a play of thrones, you could never go back to family. You could never do anything apart from guarding the wall. So in this scenario, joining the army then was like losing all ties to family, everything. You do not go back home. You are purely 247 in the army. But that's not all Askia Muhammad did. He created a fleet of war canoes on the River Niger, and he expanded the empire to cover 1.4 million square kilometers, making it the largest empire in Africa. Think about that for a moment. At that point in history, his kingdom became the largest on the continent. But the most profound impact wasn't military, it was cultural. Muhammad poured resources into Islamic scholarships, and he transformed Timbuktu from a trading post into one of Africa's greatest intellectual centers. The Sankore Mosque became a university where 25,000 scholars gathered. Some had studied in Mecca and Cairo, and they produced chronicles, legal treatises, theological works that are still studied today in Islamic jurisprudence. Think about that. That's impact born from vision. So, what did he do next? To consolidate his power, he made his nephew Mahmud Kati, who compiled the Tariq al-Fatashi, the history of the Sikha. Abdurrahman as-Asadi wrote the Tariq al-Sudan, and Ahmed Baba produced books on Islamic law that remain in use centuries later. Now, these weren't just local achievements. These were contributions to human civilization. West African voices suddenly participated in the global Islamic intellectual tradition. And all of this flowed from one man's vision that an empire could be built not just on military dominance, but on learning, trade, and purposeful governance. But here's where the story takes a tragic turn. Yes, every story has, or I wouldn't want to say every story so we don't jinx it, but most of them do have it. And when we are back from this very short break, I'm going to tell you what that tragic turn was and how, we are going to get to my favorite part, which is the segment where we talk about the 4M blueprint. So stick around, and I'm going to play you a very beautiful ensemble by Vangelis titled Chariots of Fire. Welcome back to Did You Know, coming to you exclusively on Volt 104.3 FM. If you're just joining us, you missed out on a big chunk of the show, but you're welcome to join us because we are getting into the most interesting part of the show, which is where we get to talk about the 4M blueprint. But before we get into the 4M blueprint, and I know a couple of you are super excited to have at it, and we just need to tidy up one of the tragic turns in the story we've been discussing this evening. We're looking into the story of King Askia Muhammad I. And before we went on the short break we just came back from, and we're talking about how his story took a tragic turn. Yes, how the story took a tragic turn. See, like, this is the part of the story where a lot of things happen. When we spoke about the king who gave away his kingdom with a handshake, it was touching to some extent. But this time around, we are going to see how power, when poorly consolidated, leads into something that is unsavory, basically. Remember, we said that he didn't execute the previous king who he defeated in a battle. He didn't execute him. He didn't, unalived him, as we say now, according to Gen Z right now. Instead, he sent him on exile, right? So, you know how we say history is actually cyclical, funny, or it's always, there's a pun with history, right? We're about to see that pun play out right now. So, we just watched Askia Muhammad build the largest empire in African history. He created administrative systems that would be matched in Europe for centuries, well before some of these people did. Not calling any names, not throwing any shades, but he transformed a trading post into a world-class center of learning. Literally changed the price of gold through his generosity, like Mansa Musa did, okay? But what happens when the empire builder grows old? What happens when vision can't protect you from ambition? And most importantly now, what can we learn from the blueprint he created? We'll break that down in just a moment here, but I want you to picture what we've been talking about. Try and picture it. I want you to keep it in the front of your memory. Somebody who took over power not from destiny or ego or ambition, but from purpose. Because, there's a saying that goes that everyone is the hero in their own story, right? And secondly, when we talk about power, a lot of people can pontificate about power, how you came into power, but the bottom line will always be what you did when you were in charge, when you were in control of the helm of affairs, what you did, basically. And Askia Muhammad took the Songhai Empire and transformed it through vision, reform, and strategic brilliance. We saw him go from a military general to empire builder to a religious reformer, fusing religion and government. And then we also saw him create a legacy that still echoes today. But how did he do this? How did he achieve this? And to kind of wrap up the story, he made his children ministers in charge of provinces, ministers in charge of states, ministers in charge of helms of affairs. He made his cousins in key position in power. So when you have family running these units, it's obviously going to be that loyalty is a must, right? Unfortunately, sometimes it isn't a given, because there's always the battle of the first son and the other sons. The first son who is destined to be the next one in line by being the first, and then the other sons who feel like, hey, it should be me, or something like that. But in 1 minute, I'll wrap up how he ended up, because one of his sons took power, sent him on exile like he did the king before him, because they noticed he was